Postmodernism has enjoyed considerable success in universities all over the English-speaking world. As a result, its ideas and theses heavily influence decisions that are made by academics and administrators on a daily basis. What do these decisions look like? It has long been noticed that a central idea of postmodern philosophy was an openness to relativism, at least about facts or knowledge. It has also long been noticed that most authors and academics who have been described as postmodernists, notwithstanding the disputed meaning of this label, are by no means relativists about moral values. If obscure prose and moral grandstanding have been among the key features of postmodernist writings, there is an increasing sense among the critics of postmodernism that moral clarity is now central, while textual obscurity has diminished in importance. The authors of the Grievance Studies hoax, including Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, have described this evolution as the turn towards applied postmodernism. My guest for this episode, Oliver Traldi, agrees. As he wrote, postmodernism isn't playing around anymore. Hi everyone, I am thrilled to be here with Oliver Traldi. Oliver, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So you're now a PhD student in philosophy at Notre Dame University, after getting a master's degree from Tufts University. And you're also a regular contributor to Quillette magazine and Ario magazine, among others, where you often discuss campus politics, postmodernism, freedom of speech, and other related topics. And these are really, I would say, core themes of our podcast. And I wanted to start by asking you how you got interested in these topics in the first place. I mean, this is a very sort of predictable opening question, but I was wondering if you had some sort of first-hand encounter with campus orthodoxy, or maybe if you just read about it repeatedly online.
No, I sure did have a first-hand encounter. I mean, for me, it's a really long story. So my interest in free speech goes back to, I guess, when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I came from, my mother was like a secular Jewish woman, and my father was not religious at all. And I was that kid in my elementary school who was angry that we had to sing all these religious songs, right, in our school chorus. So like there was no way to sing in the chorus and not sing about, God and Jesus and things like that. And back then, this seemed like a kind of freedom of speech issue to me, seemed like a separation of church and state issue to me. And this is when I was about 8 or 9 years old. A few years later, I started to get upset about, school dress codes and things like that. And so I guess, in my childhood, I was this kind of standard, I guess, more left-wing ACLU supporting free speech, not activist because I was just some kid, but those were my interests. Then on campus, I noted a different dynamic. I wouldn't say that. So some people say that the dynamic on campus is like, social justice as another religion. I'm not sure that I would put it that way. But the free speech concerns were definitely going in the other direction. Late in my time in college, I was involved with the student government, and there was an event that, at which there were no white students allowed. Or the event was a quote unquote anti-racist training.
Right.
And there was a session for white students and a session for non-white students. Okay. And this is just, in the most public room on campus. Mm-hmm. So a few of us kind of tried to push back against this. We were saying people's rights of free speech and free association aren't being respected on the campus. We were immediately pegged as, racist with white male power and so forth. Not even primarily by fellow students, but by, the administration of the college. Mm-hmm. And that led me to think that on campus, and I'm interested in campus politics because I'm on a campus. I'm training to be an academic. I don't necessarily think that, when there's an article in the New York Times or something about campus politics, I find it interesting. But my interest in campus politics is just because I'm in academia. I don't claim to have an argument for why everybody else should be concerned about it. But that all convinced me that things should on campus were kind of going in the opposite direction. And when I spoke to people about it, and this is a decade ago now, but I would speak to people about it, and there would be these just all these cliches that are by now are familiar, but back then were pretty new, about safe spaces and about microaggressions and about how it's not discrimination if it's you can't discriminate up, you can only discriminate down, right? Like discrimination equals discrimination plus power. And so I guess my firsthand experience, which in the end was really very minor, led me to start wondering if there were the same sorts of cliches, first of all, on the left that I had observed growing up in the right, and if there were, the same sorts of cliches in academia that there were elsewhere. You would maybe hope that academia would be a more reflective place. And I think in general, academics are quite reflective. But the campus environment is not just academics. There's also students, and there's especially these administrators who are trained in programs that are very critical theory oriented. A master's in higher education management, you're going to be reading a lot of Foucault, a lot of things like that. And they're also trained in the perspective that the job, like their primary job on a college campus is to protect the fragile mental health of the students, right? So there's this kind of dogma of student vulnerability and student fragility. I kind of kept all these thoughts to myself for quite a while, really, as I was in my 20s and kind of trying to figure out what to do with my life. And they just kind of simmered, and I had, kind of private conversations with people about them. And it was kind of after the election of Donald Trump in 2016 that I was part of this group of people that were saying, hey, look, like part of what caused this is these unreflective, kind of like dogmatic, sloganeering attitudes on the left that are just not responsive to facts and are not, interested in dialogue with people who disagree. So I very much took the view that maybe not campus politics in particular, but the sorts of attitudes of the journalistic and kind of professional political consultant class that had come out of their training in critical theory disciplines and things like that on campus, and had led to, the sorts of articles we can all read every day now, on BuzzFeed and on, Everyday Feminism and places like this about how, all white people are racist and this and that. I suddenly saw that this thing that I had thought about for years, actually had what I thought was a greater import. So the long answer to a short question, but that's how I got involved in writing for, Quillette first, and then Aereo, and now ArcDigi, and sending my essays a few other places. So yeah.
Okay, so among those essays, of yours, I really liked Postmodernism Isn't Playing Around Anymore, in particular, which Aereo magazine was published in January of last year. And there you were discussing the role of play or playfulness in postmodernism. And so you claim that while playfulness was central during what some people have called the high deconstructive phase. In other words, when the French post-structuralists were dominant, it has very much receded in the background in more recent times. And maybe before we can discuss this evolution of postmodernism, you can start by explaining what you have in mind when you talk about play.
Yeah. So I guess so. First of all, I've come to question whether postmodernism is even. Everybody argues about what postmodernism is when we talk about it. So this article came out of like an early tension that I was trying to think about. So if you read the authors who are most commonly called postmodernists, these are people like Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault to an extent, Jean Baudrillard, a few others. There's a kind of indeterminacy in their writings that they think is essential in both in language and in the world, right? Words don't really necessarily mean any one thing or another. There's like this infinite series of interpretations and explanations you can give to any text. And in fact, like one of the early things the postmodernists would do was they would take a piece of writing that they thought was like politically reactionary, and they would show how its internal logic was actually like liberatory, right? So they would turn the things they disagreed with into things that they agreed with. So the same thing was true of like material reality, right? They were saying you can't get to material reality except through text, right? They use this phrase "always already." I don't know what the French is for it, but they say, you're kind of always already imbued with these, like memes in your head that are determining how you're seeing the world, that are actually constructing the world for you. And so there's no like true world out there, or maybe there is, but we don't have access to it. So you play with the text, you play with the memes, and in that way you're playing with reality to a certain extent, or to whatever piece of reality it is that you're actually touching, if there even is one. They didn't think that there was any linear progress of history. They didn't think that there was this Marxist story. This is why I think a lot of people don't like this phrase from Jordan Peterson, postmodern neo-Marxist, right? Because the Marxists, or at least Marx himself, thought there was this like, well, it went from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. And then before feudalism, there were all these other things that I don't remember. So that is a very linear progression, and he thought there were laws of history that determined this. The postmodernists would all disagree with this, right? They would say, well, it's not going to be determined by the material facts on the ground, because the material, is already caught up in the signs and the texts and everything, right? So there's no distinction between symbols and material objects anymore. And so you can kind of play around with the direction of history by playing around with culture and with narratives and text and things like that, and it can go in any direction. So when I say playfulness, I mean this kind of indeterminacy where you don't know anything for sure. You don't know where anything is going. Nothing has to mean any particular thing. And this was just like maybe the major theme of the postmodernists in kind of the high phase of like maybe the 70s and 80s. And it's most of what I learned when I read, in college. I was trained in to a certain extent in critical theory and in postmodern disciplines, and when I would take classes in literary theory or social theory, when we read the postmodernists, it would be a lot of stuff like this. And so what I address in my article for Area, which is a while back now, but I think I still stand by it, is basically like there's a confusion, and I don't know if it's a confusion maybe it's a confusion for us who attribute all these phenomena to postmodernism, or maybe it's a confusion for the people who kind of cite postmodernist authors but then treat them in this non-playful way, that there's a lot of like in modern campus activism, which is taken to be kind of have an inheritance from the postmodern tradition and from the tradition of critical theory. That is to say, the critical theory of the 70s and 80s, not the critical theory of like the 30s and the 40s.
Sure.
Well, you know, if you say something offensive, they will tell you, no, this is exactly what that means, right? They will lay out and, you know, they will have a theory of what that means, and they will tell you that is the authoritative meaning. And if you talk about questions about, you know, is there implicit bias, you know, in academia, the so-called postmodernists of the current phase of the climate on campus are not going to say, well, it's indeterminate, right? You know, like we can play around with various things, you know, the signs and the text and whatever, all like dancing around. No, they're going to say, for sure, we know this. This is a fact, right? So that's what I mean by playfulness, this idea that nothing is set in stone, anything can kind of change at any moment, versus, and especially our interpretation of words and of cultural text versus the kind of authoritative and censorious view of like, no, I have piles for where where various pieces of text and reality go. Here are the offensive ones, and here are the ones that are okay. So there's a tension there. That's what I meant to be addressing in that piece.
Mm-hmm. So this reminds me, before we discuss your essay further, I mean, it's very much connected, but the idea that postmodernism isn't playing around anymore reminds me of the account given by Helen Pluckrose, the editor of Areo magazine, because she says that postmodernism has become user-friendly, as she calls it. Also, James Lindsay talks about applied postmodernism. Helen in particular says that postmodernism has become user-friendly over maybe the last 30 years, and it's not so much about relatively arcane literary deconstruction anymore. It's more about providing sort of ready-to-use claims, ready-to-use arguments to campus activists.
Yeah, and I think one of the difficult questions for people, and I'm in this sphere, you're in this sphere, you know, the Areo people, the grievance studies hoaxers like Helen and James are in this sphere. One of the difficult questions for us is, you know, kind of like I was saying before, what exactly do we mean by postmodernism, right? If there's been this enormous change, you know, what is this core that we're trying to address here? So yeah, I definitely think that there is this inheritance, but there's also been this massive shift. I think user-friendly is a good user-friendly kind of gets at two aspects of it. One aspect is that the original, like the deconstructive writings, are incomprehensible, right? Like it's just really difficult, and that isn't necessary. You know, like, you know, high-level mathematics and physics are also incomprehensible, but I think if once you start to comprehend them, you realize that they're not really worth comprehending. But so how do you get from the incomprehensibleness of Jacques Derrida to, you know, some bustle.com article that's like, it's 2019, you know, we need to have, you know, white feminism is over, you know, and just like these very, you know, common language slogans. And it's funny because Judith Butler once, somebody asked her, why do you write like such nonsense, basically, like, why do you write so incomprehensibly? And she said something like, I need to write this way because it's like the style, the postmodern style is part of what will like unseat the oppression of reason or something like that. I don't remember exactly what she said. That's certainly not the view that the postmodernists that we are aiming at have. They write in a much more kind of like accessible the BuzzFeed style, the kind of thought catalog-y style. So I think one element of the user friendliness is just the accessibility and how these incomprehensible texts that I don't like and you don't like and Helen and James don't like, but were not in any obvious way part of any political program, have been boiled down into these nuggets. And so the second part of the user friendliness is how convenient they are to, or how convenient the new slogans are to various political programs. But they're always deployed, kind of like we were talking about before. They're always deployed very tactically. You get them at some points and not at other points, right? If there's one study that they don't like, they talk about how science is socially constructed and how biases come into every evaluation of every data. But then there's some other study that they like, and it suddenly becomes authoritative and the truth of the world. So part of what just happens is I think that politics is not a place for people who really like consistent principles, right? It's a place where you kind of make one argument when it's convenient and you make the other argument when that's convenient. So part of the user friendliness, I think, is just what happens with anything when it becomes part of politics.
Fair enough. Yeah, I would I would agree with this characterization. So we can explore the three possible reasons which you give for the sort of the recession of playfulness in postmodernism. So I will quote you for now, and then we can explore them one by one. But I can just summarize them briefly by quoting you from the article. So you say that there are three reasons that we will explore, and the first has to do with disciplinary boundaries, characteristics of the modern era, and the interdisciplinarity of postmodernism. The second reason is more political. It says that the groups who wanted to play decided to stop once they had won. And the third concerns generational psychology, snowflakes and free-range kids, both terms being in quote marks and so forth. So we can start by exploring the first reason. And one way we can approach it is by sort of following your arguments based on on recalling the definition given of modernity by Max Weber, the German sociologist, who defined modernity, cultural modernity, as the sort of intellectual practice of separating science, art, and morality in distinct spheres. And so you argue that postmodernism really tried to tear down the walls between these spheres, and perhaps even more importantly, to arrange for the moral sphere to dominate over the scientific sphere and the artistic sphere.
So this is an interesting thing about this explanation is that the interdisciplinary nature. So one cool thing about this is that I don't see this discussed almost anywhere. So I'm happy that I think this is like one of my ideas. Interdisciplinary studies came in for a lot of criticism in like the 70s and the 80s when they were just starting to become a really central practice of the university. And that was they were criticized kind of qua being interdisciplinary. So my understanding is that they were criticized for the fact that there was no one like core approach to the world and to, developing knowledge and, making new discoveries and making headway in our knowledge base, scientifically. And instead there was this hodgepodge of things being taught in these interdisciplinary programs. Now, one problem that you might think you could find with an interdisciplinary approach is that when you have a lot of options, you can kind of at any point pick whatever option gives you the result you want, right? So just for, say I'm using sociology and anthropology and literary studies in some area. I'll cite a few things in sociology, but then if there are contrary results in sociology, then I can deconstruct them with my literary approach. I don't know how frequently there's this kind of blending, but that seems like it could be a danger of interdisciplinary studies. There does seem to be this this other aspect of interdisciplinary studies that you get when you talk about the gender studies or African American studies or queer studies in the university, is that they're just explicitly activist disciplines. That's not me making a knock on them. That's how they characterize themselves, right?
Sure.
And so you get this, and this is very convenient. A very convenient place to have this dogma that science is socially constructed, right? Because if you say to them, well, how are you going to do accurate science if you're being an activist? They'll just say, well, nobody does accurate science to begin with. It's all socially constructed, right? Everybody has biases, and well, our biases are the right biases. That's where this idea that the politics kind of comes to dominate comes in, and the moral sphere kind of comes to dominate comes in, because once you can trace everything back to, once you think science is determined by somebody's values, then you can say, well, it's just a matter of having the right values, and that's your starting point. And of course, the right values are the values of social justice. Sorry, my speaking is not working. Social justice activists and fans of all the things that you and I complain about. Identity politics and things of that nature. So it's not really, in certain conversations, people talk about the value-free ideal of science. So this idea that there are never any moral values that enter into science. And I think there are philosophical problems with the idea of completely excluding values from science, that people can have a conversation about. But I think what we actually see is not just kind of moral values settling certain questions or determining what people choose to research and things like that, but you actually see the moral and political values coming to predominate, to completely set an agenda, and also to determine, what research is published, what research is thrown out, and on an individual level, who has even a seat at the table, right? Whose research is okay, in the modern parlance of that's not okay. So if your research is not okay, you no longer have a seat at the table, unless you put it in the file drawer. And this came to a head with, you asked at the beginning, how did I get involved in all this stuff? One of the things that convinced me that I needed to be thinking harder about this stuff was the replication crisis in the social sciences. So there were just all these results, and a lot of them are apolitical. Results in, so I don't mean to say that it's a purely political phenomenon, but all these results in social psychology that we're failing to replicate, and that just once you examined them, you were like, there's no theory behind this, there's no motivation, there's no reason we expected this to be true. And there's starting to be some big pillars of the scientific aspects of the social justice worldview are starting to come down. I don't know exactly, I don't know how far it will go. Lee Jussim, who you've written about, and who I've met a couple times, had a Twitter thread, I think last winter, about the contact hypothesis, for example. So the contact hypothesis is just the idea that having contact with some group reduces the negative feelings you hold toward that group, right? So, if you have a bunch of anti-Semites, they will become less anti-Semitic after contact with a whole bunch of Jews. And Lee suggests that this is not as well supported as you would think. And that is the sort of result that is relevant to this that you've seen coming down. Just a result where it's like, okay, there's some liberal progressive or social justice oriented idea of how the world works. Usually it involves discrimination or bias in some way, and those are the things that end up having trouble replicating. So long story short, that's an example of the way in which you can start to see, once you say there aren't these three spheres, you can start to see the political sphere kind of predominating over the scientific and setting the agenda and actually determining what people see fit to think is even plausible.
I think it's an easy transition to the second reason, because probably there is a connection there. So the second possible reason which you advance for playfulness becoming much less of a factor in postmodernism scholarship, and also activism, of course, is the fact that this worldview has very much achieved power on campus, sometimes almost hegemony. I mean, at least there have been attempts like at Evergreen to achieve hegemony, but certainly in many cases, lots of power much power has been collected. We mentioned early in this discussion the influence of administrators who play a big role. I mean, they are maybe this role is often underestimated in these discussions.
I think so,
yeah. And the point is that I guess to put it very very plainly or very very harshly in a way, there isn't really much of an interest in playing once you've won.
So just to talk about kind of historically how this thing could have happened, how this sort of thing could have happened. So one example would be the canon wars. You know, in the 90s there were these things called the canon wars, where there was this literary canon, right? And there was this idea of here are the books that are essential to Western civilization. Maybe it goes back further than the 90s. Maybe this was already kind of falling apart by the early 90s. But, you know, here are these books that are essential to Western civilization. Those are the things that an undergraduate in college should read, right? Because one of the points of college is just to ground yourself in an understanding of what Western civilization is and what its foundational texts are, right? Well, what you had after that was this idea, well, we need to open up the canon, right? Because turns out Western civilization, there were parts of it that were good, but there were parts of it that were bad. And one bad part of it is that the texts were largely produced by a certain kind of person, and that leads to, you know, a misunderstanding of our history and our culture, right? If you don't read anything by, you know, by Muslims, then you don't understand the reception of Aristotle. If you don't read anything by Black people, then you don't really understand the history of America. If you don't read anything by women, you don't understand the history of like the entire world. You know, so this was and there's something to this. This was largely accepted, you know, the idea that the canonical texts of Western civilization need to be rounded out and broadened. And you need kind of a bigger pool to choose from to have a more, you know, just a better understanding. And note that when we say better understanding, we're still talking about in terms of like the truth, right? You know, we're talking about getting the actual truth about our history and our literature and things like that. Just getting, you know, the actual right result. Now compare that to now, and I would say we're in like a kind of second. Maybe not the canon wars, maybe not the science wars exactly, but whatever happened in the 90s with political correctness and things like that, we're in like a second phase. We're in a, you know, there was a kind of détente, but we're in, you know, the second phase of that battle.
Yeah.
And now what happens is that when previously the conversation was about whether our understanding of Western civilization needs to be supplemented in these various ways and broadened. Now the conversation is about, well, should people even be able to talk about Western civilization at all? Should we even talk about Western civilization as a good thing? Is it even responsible to teach a course called Western civilization? We have this in my discipline of philosophy. There's a university in Australia recently got funding to do some kind of like an undergraduate degree in Western civilization, or a master's degree in the history of Western civilization that's partly run through the philosophy department, a history of Western thought kind of thing. I'm messing up the details, and this is, there's a lot of philosophers who oppose this because they say, look, any discussion of Western civilization is promoting the alt-right fascist viewpoint that there's something good about Western civilization and so forth. And so, yeah, when I talk about you play until you win, there's this idea of, well, maybe we can interpret these texts in various ways. Maybe we can broaden these canons and these literatures. And then there's a moment where the people who had tried to open things up then gain capture of the institutions. And then that is a point at which they can put their foot down and say, we were lying before. We have the authoritative interpretation, right? We can tell you what these texts actually mean, and we can tell you what the right way, rather than experimenting with how to teach a course on Western civilization, we can tell you what the right way is. And the right way is to talk about how it's problematic and how thinking Western civilization is good is racist and things like that. And I'm not here to defend Western civilization. I'm just talking about this kind of pattern of things open up and then they close back down in a different place, right? Back in, I think it was Gayatri Spivak or maybe Stella Ben Habib or something. There's an interview from the early 90s where one of these deconstructionists, somebody's questioning, this is during the Canon Wars, somebody's questioning them in an interview for some magazine. And they're saying, okay, so how would you construct a syllabus about Western civilization? What would be your canonical text? And this postmodern thinker, Spivak, I think it probably was, says, well, look, I think, constructing any syllabus is like oppressive, right? Because you have to exclude things. You're always marginalizing something when you, so that's the playful idea, right? Is that no matter what you do, something's excluded. You always have to make choices. So you can always be doing this experimenting. You never quite get the right story. So you're always just playing around in these various kind of ways of being inaccurate because there's actually no way to get the right idea, right? And that is just fundamentally different from what that has actually, I think, led to, which is the idea that any course on Western civilization must essentially be a course about a history of oppression, that the consensus now is that Western civilization has kind of, wreaked on the world. So that's the sort of transition that I'm talking about. The transition from, there's no one right syllabus. We have to throw a bunch of ideas around. You can experiment with whatever, to now being like, you need to teach people that this is right and this is wrong. And that's one of the points of college, is to teach people the wrongs of history.
Yeah, so I think this is where I can connect it to the point I was making in my Quillette.
It was a very nice piece, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. So I was noting in that article how common it has become, at least in my estimation, for pretty or very political academics and students to believe, or at least to claim, that scientific knowledge is really on their side. And they really seem to believe that the research shows that, for instance, there is no biological basis for, not any biological basis for the psychological differences between men and women. They will at least claim to believe that the research shows how serious things, how things like stereotype threats, microaggressions, etc., how serious they are. And one can give a very, I think, famous by now example. There was this TV program on Canadian TV. It's called The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and Jordan Peterson was there. And he had several people on the panel with him, and one of the co-panelists was actually someone else from Toronto University, like Peterson himself. And this person is a historian, and his almost the first thing that he says is, it's not true that there is such a thing as biological sex.
Right, yeah.
And he very clearly seems to think that the sort of medical biological literature is backing him up. And I was claiming in this Quillette article that I've seen more claims like these sort of propping up left and right. And I was claiming that, when people can really believe that, it shows that, postmodern social justice, for lack of a better word, has really achieved such dominance in the relevant academic disciplines that there is much less need for militant scholars to reach for Foucault and say his indictment of science is just a power play. And this is, I think, where we reconnect to what you were saying.
Yeah, I definitely agree 100%. The denial of biological sex, it's such a strange, because you kind of need something like the postmodern idea to even entertain it, right? Because there's no such thing as biological sex keep cropping up. Yeah, I think methodologically, I don't want to say before postmodernism, but one natural way that you would address sex research was that you would kind of begin with the phenomenon of biological sex, right? You would say, one of the things that we need to explain is the fact that some 99.9%, I don't know the exact number, but some very significant percentage of the human population, and to my knowledge, most animal populations, are split into, two kinds, so to speak. And that's kind of like the fact that remains to be explained. So you kind of need the postmodern influence at the beginning just to deny, what many people would take to be the foundational fact, right? Like that's the fact that begins your investigation. That's not something that you're trying to establish. That's the thing that you're trying to explain. You've observed that in the world, right? So there's a sense in which you need to have this very playful view that's like, we can question everything. We can question all of our observations, all the categories that we might have thought are natural and that help us deal with the world around us. Maybe those categories are actually like limiting the possibilities that we see, So you need an idea like that. And then you come up with this other idea that's like, okay, maybe there isn't any such thing in this category. And then suddenly you're not playing around anymore, right? Suddenly there's a new dogma. There's no biological sex, and there's no method of questioning that, right? Suddenly this whole playful idea and this whole experimental mindset falls away immediately. Or maybe not immediately, but eventually. And so that's why I think you and I are probably talking about pretty much the same pattern there. But there is, there does remain, this kind of mystery, right? Like how did people forget about this playfulness so quickly? And I think if you talk to not all of them, but a certain kind of like older postmodern or critical theory scholar, who maybe was trained in, say, the 60s or the 70s, and got their PhD then, that sort of person, I think there's some likelihood that they'll be maybe a little bit bemused by this. And the postmodernists themselves, the early postmodernists, I think Claire from Quillette, or maybe it's Adrian from, there's somebody who loves tweeting about this. But like a whole lot of them signed on to this this petition to decriminalize pedophilia. It was like Foucault was on it, and maybe like Althusser and some others. So that's a great example of just like there are, this anti-pedophilia thing. That's just like a social construction, of like the dominant oppressive morality. And of course, there's your modern university postmodernist is going to be completely opposed to decriminalizing pedophilia, at least by and large, you would think. They, some of them want to criminalize a whole lot of other sex. So that's I think the sort of example of the change that would possibly still bemuse some, literary scholars and people like that who are still active in the academy.
Yeah. I was thinking, I don't know, this might be one of the reasons, because I should start by, I don't know if you share my experience, but I've noticed that if I criticize, say, contemporary social justice activism for reason X, then, okay, I will get a certain type of pushback. And then, say, a few days later, I criticize sort of more old school postmodernism for reason X prime. And I will get a similar type of pushback from broadly the same people. And then a few days later still, I will say, oh, look, this is how sort of French post-structuralism, early American campus postmodernism gave rise in the end to what we have these days. And then they will get very upset. They will say, I don't see the connection. I don't see the continuity. You're making stuff up. Whereas I was making broadly the same criticism, and they sort of objected to it in similar terms, defending, on the one hand, old school postmodernism, on the other, contemporary social justice.
Right.
Broadly in similar terms, yet they will get upset usually when you point the connection between the two. And here I'm talking about people who are, sort of broadly, or actually very sympathetic to contemporary social justice, perhaps certainly slightly more sophisticated than your average.
Right. So are you talking about people from the academy or more like journalistic people?
Yeah, more or less sort of from or around the academy, people who have some training certainly in the social sciences or the humanities. And mostly I've noticed this actually on the French-speaking internet, more so than on the English-speaking internet.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know much about what is the reputation at the moment of like Derrida or Foucault in France. Are they still considered major thinkers, or
That's a difficult question. So, because I myself, I never had, I never worked or studied in these disciplines. I have a background and training and professional activity in a completely different field, which is in the natural sciences. So it's hard for me to say, but what I would say is I think there is a broad consensus that they have not achieved the same success in France as they have in America, especially. And probably Derrida especially. Foucault is, I think, somewhat known still in France. Of course, Derrida as well, but not to the same extent. But neither of them has achieved quite the same success in France.
Yeah, I think that in its own way, I'm changing the subject a little bit, so I apologize for that, but I think that in its own way is a really interesting phenomenon. Why was postmodernism, which was kind of maybe a little bit more of a flash in the pan in France, why did it gain such a foothold in the American university in particular? And if you talk to, in America, there are kind of, if you talk to like old-fashioned, like class-based leftists, like more older school, like Marxist pro-union types, less identity politics, more like class politics types. There's I mean, I was going to call it a conspiracy theory, but it's not, it's actually plausible. And it's been around since Derrida gave his very first talk at Johns Hopkins, his structure, sign, and play talk, which is that, all this stuff about there's no right and wrong and you can play around with whatever and just like, have a freewheeling engagement with issues and stuff like that. And, material is the same as the symbolic. There's no hierarchy there. That can, there's, like we were saying, there's no natural political program that comes out of that, right?
Right.
And so starting in the 70s, there were already more class-based leftists who were starting to say, look, this is destabilizing, leftism in America. This is very libertarian way to think about the world. And you can't get saying that symbols are the same as material. You can't get any kind of political movement out of this. And I think one of the ways in which there is a continuity, and I wonder if this is the sort of thing that people deny when you're talking to them, is that then there was this kind of flip where it became, rather than symbols being like material and there being this kind of lack of hierarchy, rather than that being a playful idea where you can play around with reality just like you can play around with words, now it's become that, symbols can be just as oppressive as material conditions, right? You can kind of lock somebody in or starve them, so to speak, by not having the right people win the Grammys or something like that, or the Oscars. There was the Oscars quite a few years ago. That is like the same level or the same type of oppression. So there was this political program that came out of it, but it took a while, and you had to kind of flip a few things on their heads first.
Sure.
I'm curious about the people who deny the connection. I mean, certainly there are people who will say, before I distinguish like 70s and 80s critical theory deconstruction from like the 30s and 40s, like Frankfurt School, there are certainly people who in like the modern day academic left who will claim, they will say, I don't want any of that like Derrida stuff. I go back to like Adorno and Horkheimer and Walter Benjamin, people like that. And I don't know much. I mean, I've read them for classes and I've read them on my own, but I don't know much about, which influences are theirs versus which influences are of the deconstructionists and the post-structuralists.
This is a bit hard to disentangle because, one way of saying this is that Foucault himself, at some point, he was already famous, but at some point he became familiar with the work of Adorno and Horkheimer in particular. I think it was, the dialectic der Aufklärung, the dialectic of enlightenment. He became familiar with that, and he said in an interview, I see very common themes with my work, and had I known of their work earlier, I would have saved time. That's what he said. So it is a bit difficult to disentangle, and one can add, of course, another consideration, which is the large influence, as far as I can see, of Marcuse on the campus left. Because he was himself a former student of the Frankfurt School. I don't know if he was a student because he was more of a student of Heidegger, I think. But he was a member of the Frankfurt School before going to America. And so I think both the sort of German, I don't know how to call it, Frankfurt critical theory of the 30s and the 40s, and also the sort of French Heideggerian critical theories of the 50s and the 60s had influence on the American campus left. I would say probably the latter has had quite a bit more, would be my guess.
Yeah, and just from an intellectual history perspective, the influence of Heidegger is a really interesting question, because Heidegger was obviously a big influence on Derrida as well. and into
for sure.
deconstruction that way. Now Marcuse, Paul Gottfried, one of the founders of the alt-right, studied with Marcuse, right? So Marcuse is such an interesting figure because you can get from Heidegger, who was an out-and-out Nazi, to Marcuse, and then you get right back into the alt-right so quickly. And this is my other, this is one of my broad things about postmodern disciplines and critical theory. I tried to write an essay about this, but it wasn't very good and it hasn't been published. I need to go back to it sometime. But I think there's just no reason to think that if you're comparing philosophers and thinkers and you're looking at the continental thinkers versus the Anglophone school, the Anglophone school has John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell, and John Locke. And if you compare that to Heidegger and Paul Demion and it's just not clear that you're actually. It's not clear in any way that based on the kind of social justice idea of let's not read this problematic person. There's no reason that you should prefer continental philosophy and critical theory to the Anglophone tradition, right? Continental philosophy and critical theory are full of incredibly just monstrous figures, including we were talking about the decriminalizing pedophilia stuff. However you feel about that, it's something that they would probably find problematic. And it's just a very interesting thing to me that Derrida himself denied this about Heidegger for a long time, and then it was it doesn't matter, you don't need to think about it. And it's crazy to me that this tradition that is full of these real monsters of intellectual history, they're the good guys in campus politics. They're the less problematic ones. And people like Bertrand Russell who are you need to you should have a liberal, equal society, treat people well, but also use logic and evidence, just very simple things. This is seen as the evil of Western civilization. And so that is a real, nobody has ever managed to explain to me how the intellectual history, how it could possibly make any sense that it worked out like that. That is something that I'm really curious about. One thing to say would just be at a very intuitive level, the people who say they're the good people are not always the good people, right? So if you think of there as being this authoritarian streak in campus politics, then it makes sense that there's an inheritance from somebody like Heidegger. But that's, I'm not an intellectual historian, so I'm probably doing injustice to all these people, but
I think I have some hypotheses to that, and the first one is actually very straightforward. Would be the simple point that the legacy of these sort of big, mostly German thinkers actually has been sort of dissolved, but their individual contributions has been, or rather, the fact that they contributed has been forgotten. Even if you go, I guess it's sort of a continuation of the point I was making earlier, which is that I don't know what, if you took sort of the average sort of campus activist, I don't know what they would say if you try to engage in conversation about Derrida or Foucault. I'm not sure. I am not sure they know how much they owe to them in their thought. So if you try to tell them that you're sort of carrying the legacy of Heidegger, they'll
laugh at you.
It's so much of a jump. I think it's hard. It will be hard for them to see the connection there. So that would be my first point. Is simply the sort of the latency.
That's true, and that
this to happen.
That goes in both directions, right? Maybe if it has changed that much, then maybe it's not fair to tar them with that brush.
I think That's a fair point to make as well. One should see what they carry from Heidegger.
Yeah, it could be the problematic parts. It could be the non-problematic parts.
Yeah, but my second hypothesis, and this I really take mostly from Richard Wolin's book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called The Seduction of Unreason. And the subtitle is The Intellectual Romance with Fascism from Nietzsche to Postmodernism.
Okay.
And he coins this phrase, which is left Heideggerianism.
Right.
Or Heideggerian leftism. And he says that it's essentially, I mean, or at least my sort of translation of it for our current purposes would be the Heideggerian ideas that identity matters a lot, that the blood and the soil, the Blut und Boden in German, are sort of constitutive of the thought of a people, that the character of thought is collectivistic and national. It's sort of earthbound. This is sort of a culmination of themes that were dominant in 19th century German philosophy when there was this reaction to the French Revolution and to the Enlightenment more broadly.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing, that kind of collectivism, that's the sort of thing that could be, obviously it's taken to be problematic when it's said, when people say that it has like a genetic basis,
right? But
it remains kind of like insular and collectivistic and xenophobic, even when you say, well, this is about culture, this is about, this is all socially constructed. I don't think that takes away any of the things that people genuinely find like negative about it. But it is the sort of view that you find espoused, by people in, within these movements to an extent.
I mean, one can draw a parallel. I mean, I think I've already drawn it, but one can push it further. I mean, the sort of German counter-Enlightenment idea that science and liberalism and sort of cosmopolitanism and the idea of having people from different backgrounds discussing and trading and mixing. There was this idea that this is maybe good for the English, maybe it's good enough for the French, but for the Germans, it's not going to fly.
Right.
And now it's similar. There is this idea that I don't know if you've seen this online discussion. I mean, now it's been a while, but there was this Sargon of Akkad was having a debate at some conference, and the guy that was his contradictor uttered the famous sentence, "Freedom allows white men to control everything." This idea that liberalism only suits quotes white men, unquotes. It's very much in parallel. So that would be my.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that goes back to what we were talking about, the Anglophone thinkers, and obviously, many French thinkers as well, just not French postmodernists, but obviously like Rousseau and, Voltaire and everybody, and many Enlightenment figures. It goes to this idea that, the idea is, although these Anglophone ideas kind of sound good on the face, they've been used to the benefit of some and to the detriment of others, I guess. And you end up with, I think it's not so different from what you see with like safe spaces and segregated dorms on campus and stuff like that. When people say, look, if, an open discussion serves the powerful, what will serve the marginalized groups is when you close things off and give them a space of their own. And I'm not as familiar with like the German counter-Enlightenment, but there definitely seems to be a commonality there.
Yeah, I would argue so. Actually, I have a very silly question for you. It's just, I was listening to an interview of yours. I can't remember the show, but you mentioned this funny video of some guy at a demonstration, and I have no idea who this guy is or how much he means what he's saying, but he was claiming that Donald Trump was the final achievement of German idealism, and this really fascinated me in its connection to sort of some themes that I've been thinking about. You know, this connection between the broadly German tradition of philosophy and authoritarianism in general, and also, you know, mysticism. And I guess the guy was going and ranting about aliens in the Atlantis and so on. And
it's a funny video. If you search YouTube for I think it's "Complete the System of German Idealism," something like that. You'll find it. I mean, that is I think he actually followed me back on Twitter at one point. That's Kantbot on Twitter. So he's a great example of like I mean, he's a kind of autodidact. I don't think he's trained. Mm-hmm. I don't think he's been to grad. I don't even know if he's been to college. But he and it's so, I find people like that fascinating because of how much they know, and yet they're kind of not. They don't have like they're not within like the professionalization of the university, and so their knowledge takes this completely different form. So he's somebody who's read all this like Fichte and Schelling, you know, and Schlegel, all these like romanticists, and I guess I don't know if he was just drawing a connection between the things he's read and Donald Trump, or if he happens to have a theory. But I don't know if I have any thoughts on it. It's just a very funny video.
Maybe to close this particular topic before we move on to the third possible reason.
Oh, right. We still have a third.
For postmodernism's current lack of playfulness. This is something which you just you hinted at a few minutes ago, because you mentioned one of the founders of the alt-right, right? That he was a student of Marcuse. And this really, is in correspondence. Corroborates the fact that, for instance, Richard Spencer, the sort of the head figure of the alt-right, he's famous, of course, for quoting Nietzsche, but I think he also studied a lot of Adorno.
Yeah, and, he went to graduate school at UChicago and at Duke, and he wrote a master's thesis in intellectual history on Adorno. And I find that incredibly interesting. There's also another one. This was all going to be in this article that didn't turn out well, but another one is this guy Jason Reza Giorgiani, who got a PhD at Stony Brook, which is an American university that specializes in continental philosophy, and he wrote a book on it's not on Hegel and Heidegger, but a lot of it is about it's a really weird book. It's about like paranormal phenomena and like ESP and stuff, but he's always he is always using Heidegger and Hegel to talk about these phenomena. And he's like a complete like alt-right. His like PhD was rescinded by the university for his involvement in the alt-right. But the funny thing is how it makes complete sense. Like his engagement with them makes complete sense based on what these writers thought. And when he talks about he'll talk about the spirit of a people. I've read things he's written. I read the introduction to his book. I've read some of his speeches. He talks about like the spirit of a people, and he quotes Hegel and he quotes Heidegger, and he talks about how, you know, this type of people have this spirit and that type of people have that spirit. And it's all very, you know, to my kind of Anglophone liberal mind that is into this kind of salon environment and diversity and things like that. It's all very unpleasant, but there's nothing in it that is at all opposed to these postmodern, well, maybe not, maybe before postmodern, but to the thinkers that are kind of broadly the ones who inspired the postmodern tradition.
Sure.
And on the other side, I just wanted to bring this up because it's such a fascinating thing. We were talking about how there's this other side of leftism that is just this materialist class-based leftism. You know, you have Vladimir Lenin, of all people, wrote a book that is basically like a book on scientific realism, right? Like it's a book on the world. I'm forgetting the title off the top of my head, but I love talking about it because it's just so funny and it doesn't fit at all with this picture of the left as obsessed with identity. And his book is basically, it's about how material things are real and how science gets things right. So that I think is a fascinating divide, and it really makes you question, the identification of leftism with this strange part of the campus left. And, it makes you think about what affinities there might be that people don't think about between somebody like Giorgiani and, like the literary theory department at your local university.
Okay, so we can close maybe our conversation by briefly discussing the third possible reason for the lack of playfulness in contemporary postmodernism. And here we could broadly call it the Jonathan Haidt thesis. I suppose would be a way of calling it. The idea would be that playing even with words and ideas is very dangerous because, there is this very common idea now that words are violence. They are very detrimental to the psychological health of people and students in particular in this case. And so now we can, I suppose, bring it back, among other things, to the administrators with whom we were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you want to sort of tackle this last point, but
I think this is maybe the point in the essay that I found a little bit more persuasive a year ago. Since then, I've kind of looked at I wrote this article for ArcDigi on this study that was done at Smith, a kind of comparative study at Smith College of attitudes towards free speech in 2000 and in 2016. And the view of it was done by a Smith professor and by like one undergrad in 2000 and a different undergrad with him in 2016. And their view was that at least in college campuses, we're not seeing this. There may be this separate phenomenon of fragility, but that student activists, at least, are not. They're way more aggressive.
Yeah.
And they themselves are kind of searching out these conflicts in a way that you might not expect from people with like a genuine fragility. Now, I definitely think that there is a culture of fragility on college campuses that we've been talking kind of on and off through this conversation about college administrators, and that's definitely a big source of it. Every time there's something at a college where students write up, here are our demands, here's how we want this college to change, almost inevitably, every single one will have something like, we need more like mental health counselors. We need mental health counselors specifically for women and specifically for people of color and specifically for disabled people and things like that. And it's all framed in terms of mental health. So the mental health framing is absolutely there.
Yeah.
And I think that the college administrators really do believe it. And there was a great article along these lines by Jeannie Suk in the New Yorker. I'm forgetting the name now. I've linked it to so many people. I don't know how I can forget the name. It's like losing that homey feeling or something like.
Okay.
Or a new family. Yeah, it's called A New Family Feeling on Campus.
Got it.
And her idea, and this was from might be like 4 years ago now, back during like the Missouri protests and the Yale protests. You probably remember the Yale protest when Erica Christakis, that's right. Nick Christakis' wife.
Yeah.
Nick is, of course, pretty vocal in some of these circles now.
Yeah.
So Professor Christakis sent around a letter saying, you kids should make your own decisions about what to wear for Halloween, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was taken to be very offensive by these students. And Jeannie Suk, who's a Harvard law professor, kind of took these students at their word and said, what we're seeing here is these kinds of, students who are just breaking down because they need, what they're looking for in a campus is just like 4 more years of childhood, right? They're looking to have like the in loco parentis role is the most important role that they see. And they're looking to really be coddled and cared for when they're on campus and in this mental health way. So that's one perspective. And yeah, like I said, the counterpoint to that is just like, do we really see these students as backing down from a fight? Do we really see them? There are certainly points at which they claim to have these characteristics, and I'm sure some of them are doing it honestly. But if we really look at the phenomenon, it is kind of a very they search out these points of conflict. That was the view of this professor at Smith, at least. So I don't know how I feel about this coddling of the students' snowflakey perspective anymore.
I mean, I guess one could hypothesize that people who are already fragile, already sort of, uncomfortable mentally, might be counterintuitively more likely to take part in very, strident, very forceful activism as a sort of avenue that would allow them to alleviate some suffering, if you will. It would be a sort of what would be the word? I mean, some sort of relief provider.
Yeah, I definitely think this is something I think about a lot, because in online, even in the IDW, in like online activism, an enormous, like, just out of this world compared to the human populace, an enormous proportion of people who are involved in online activism do have diagnosed mental health issues of some type, and often have, like, the thing that I think is really common is like chronic pain disorders. So you definitely see people who are who feel some kind of internal anguish and are looking to kind of, transmit that and kind of get it away from themselves, like onto somebody else. And I've been guilty of that in the past. I can be very aggressive on Twitter, and it is true that, like, the worse my day is, the worse I am to other people on Twitter. That's just like a natural human fact. So I don't mean to suggest that these students are necessarily not going through these things. It definitely does make psychological sense to say, if you really are in this kind of, if you really are suffering, then that makes you more likely to kind of heighten the stakes, and to also to kind of look to project it onto others, so to speak. So I definitely agree with you about that. I think it's interesting to me to think about, like, what sort of evidence. I don't know exactly what sort of evidence I would want in order to really establish this thesis. I also haven't read. I have met John Haidt a few times. He's a really, really nice guy. I have not read the actual Coddling of the American Mind book yet. So I would have to read that, like, in full to really give a good estimation of the breadth of the evidence that he brings.
I haven't read it yet, unfortunately, but so many books, so little time, as they say.
Yeah, it's certainly true.
Yeah. So I've reached the end of my questions. Is there something else you would like to bring up before we wrap it up?
No, I guess there's one thing. I touched on this in the beginning, but just like the one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is, it does seem like, even in like the year since I wrote this Postmodernism Isn't Playing Around thing, right? This kind of, whatever it is that you and I are part of, and I don't even like being part of things generally, but what this whole pro free speech, anti postmodernism kind of feeling has grown, right? It's found supporters in the New York Times, and it's found, we had the Heterodox Academy thing last June. And this group has continued growing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the thing I would say to people in this group, which I am also a part of, is just I think it's really important that we make sure to, the criticisms that we have leveled at social justice
mm-hmm.
warriors or whoever, social justice activists, at campus politics, is important to make sure that we also apply the same standards to ourselves. So one thing I'm thinking about a lot recently is in the early days of this movement, there's a lot of talk about concept creep with words like racism, right? Racism meant something different 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to keep track of it. So it's really hard not to be racist.
Right.
And I think it's important that if we're really critical of that we keep ourselves from doing the same thing with words like identity politics or political correctness or postmodernism or social justice, that it would be great to, and I haven't managed to do this, but if we really are going to make opposition to these things central, we should really have pretty clearer than we have. We should have operational definitions. That's what we would need in order to, to people who aren't on our side. That's what we would need to really communicate to them if we wanted to kind of convince them and bring them over. So that, I think, is a direction. That's what I try to think about. Because I have this fuzzy intuitive understanding that all of these intellectual traditions are connected in this way. But like we were talking about, if somebody just doesn't see it, it's very hard to nail it down. What exactly is transmitted? What exactly is the inheritance? And I think we need to take that challenge seriously and say, let's try and be more precise about this. Let's try and convince the people who disagree with us, rather than just kind of building a movement, one movement versus another, and then another movement and then another movement after that. That isn't, at least for me, that's not, I don't like operating in that way. So I think that's my current thinking on the matter. If that makes any sense at all.
Fair enough. No, I think it's similar to some thoughts that I've had. So we can end it here.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun talking to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.